Hello, mortals! I am the BookTube God. It's the #1 drag queen booktuber on YouTube. During one of my famous live streams, we got to talking about fantasy genres, and it was suggested that I make a video on different fantasy genres. So let's get to it. First, fantasy itself is a subgenre of what is called speculative fiction. Speculative fiction is a term coined by science fiction author Robert Heinlein to encompass all fantastic fiction, and speculative fiction can be divided into three main genres: science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Over the years, each of these categories became broken down into subgenres. For example, in science fiction, there is hard science fiction, soft science fiction, space operas, and so on. In horror, there is psychological horror, monster horror, paranormal horror, and so forth. But fantasy seems to have been broken down into the most subgenres. When researching fantasy subgenres, I'll run across claims of 50 subgenres. 50! That is insane. I just want to touch base on the major fantasy subgenres and maybe go over a few of the lesser known ones that I enjoy, because this is my channel. But first, let's talk about why we even need genres or subgenres of anything. People, and I mean humans mostly, have a need to classify and compartmentalize everything in order to understand the world around them. Literature is no different. For simple basic marketing, publishers need to flag books as some category just in order to signal to bookstores where they should be shelved. The big categories, fantasy and science fiction, were never big enough on their own to warrant their own space in bookstores. Though maybe that's changed in some places, but they are usually shelved together. Horror, on the other hand, always had their own section. Other genre categories in fiction often have their own large following and get their own bookshelf space, like romance and westerns in some places. Everything else, thrillers, literary fiction, historical, contemporary, they are shelved under general fiction. So, going beyond space on bookshelves, why subdivide even further? Why break down into subgenres? I think this is driven by readers who naturally want to find similar books to those that they love. I love this book about Cinderella set in an alternate fantasy world. Hey, where can I find other books like that book? Well, here are a couple of other books that reimagine fairy tales. Hey, let's call all these books fairy tale retellings and group them together so we can find them. In the old days, fantasy was broken down just into two subgenres: high fantasy and low fantasy. High fantasy can be traced to Lord of the Rings and includes fantasies based in completely made-up worlds. Low fantasy includes fantasy set on Earth. But since those days, there have been so many fantasy books and stories created that it gave birth to a host of new subgenres. What we called high fantasy, traced to Lord of the Rings, we now usually call epic fantasy, usually set up in a made-up world with medieval levels of technology and with magic. There are usually a lot of characters and different races and an overarching plot against evil. Here we find, along with Lord of the Rings, the Shannara Chronicles by Terry Brooks, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, Game of Thrones, and on and on. And there are subcategories under that. There is sword and sorcery. Not used often these days, but can be traced back to Robert E. Howard's Conan, and usually involved a warrior main character going up against an evil magic user. For example, Conan had Thulsa Doom as his nemesis. Sword and sorcery main characters usually are a little dark. We also have Michael Moorcock's Elric series, Fritz Lieber's Bafford and the Grey Mouser. Modern stories could include Patrick Rothfuss's Name of the Wind, Glenn Cook's Black Company, and Tamara Pierce's Lioness series. There have been a few subgenres spun off of sword and sorcery. You may have heard the term sword and sandals, but that usually relates to movies and references fantasy set in Grecian or Roman times involving gladiators or Hercules and things of that nature. But my favorite spin-off is called Sword and Planet Fantasy, with traditional fantasy themes that take place in outer space with multiple worlds and planets. I recently read Trudy Canavan's Millennium's Rule series, which can easily fall into that category. Another subgenre that may be dated is heroic fantasy, where there is a hero or a heroine who is on a quest, and quest is a pretty important part of heroic fantasy. The heroes usually are from humble origins or whose nobility is hidden. Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy is a good example. Now, if heroic fantasy about a hidden noble on a quest sounds familiar because it sounds a lot like the stories of King Arthur, you are right. But that is such a popular story that it has its own subgenre, Arthurian fantasy, which includes all the countless retellings of the Arthurian legend, like Mary Stewart's Crystal Cave, Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon, and a recent entry in young adult, Tracy Dion's Legendborn. Another subgenre that I heard ages ago was dark fantasy with elements of horror. Think of the Black Jewels series by Anne Bishop. However, I've heard the term Grimdark fantasy pop up. Honestly, I'm not quite sure what the difference is. Some sources say Grimdark is fantasy with more morally gray characters in a violent, gritty, real world. An example of grimdark fantasy that is often pointed out is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, which you may know is a series I've really loved, and I agree that it definitely has a morally gray character in a violent, gritty world. I'm not sure what people say when they say grimdark is more real than dark fantasy, because it is fantasy, but some people now call dark fantasy Gothic fantasy to distinguish the two genres more. But does that make it more clear? Let's move on to low fantasy, or fantasy that takes place on Earth or the real world. The obvious division in low fantasy is it in a contemporary period or is it set in the past? Contemporary fantasy is obviously set in modern times. As an obvious example, Stephanie Meyer's Twilight books, but also Neil Gaiman's American Gods, Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, and so on. Under contemporary, we can subdivide it even more. There is urban fantasy, which is contemporary fantasy that takes place predominantly in cities, like Cassandra Clare's City of Bones. Also, a few of the books mentioned could fall under supernatural fantasy, which is contemporary fantasy with traditional supernatural creatures or powers like vampires, werewolves, ghosts, witches. Think about anything written by Patricia Briggs or Kim Harrison. Before we move on to low fantasy, there's one more contemporary subgenre that I want to mention that really tickles me, and that is the superhero subgenre. This subgenre is inspired by the popularity of comic books, thank you Marvel Universe, and is usually set in contemporary times where superheroes exist. And from what I read, usually is a young adult book. My favorites, of course, are Marissa Meyer's Renegade series and TJ Klune's The Extraordinaries. Now, when we look at low fantasy set in the past, the subdivisions often fall into time periods that the books are set in. But let's first discuss historical fantasy. For me, historical fantasy is low fantasy that relies on actual historical events, usually researched by the author, and is a form of alternate history. For example, Naomi Novik's Temeraire series posits what if dragons existed in the world during the Napoleonic Wars. One of my recent favorites, The Golem and the Genie by Helene Wexler, is a heavily researched book that looks at what would happen if supernatural creatures existed at the end of the 1800s living in New York City. Okay, on to low fantasy that most people think about. First and foremost is steampunk. Steampunk is fantasy set during the Industrial Revolution, usually alternate versions of Victorian England, where fantastic elements or supernatural creatures exist. Also, technology, while not high-tech, have fantastical elements that make them go to unexpected places, like thinking machines or flying machines, technology that is half machine and half magical. However, what has thrown me in the past was the punk part of steampunk. The term steampunk derives from cyberpunk, popularized by William Gibson's Neuromancer, and has a tone which is gritty and raw and, well, punk. However, I don't find that style often in steampunk. Anyway, my favorite steampunk is by Gail Carriger in her Soulless series, which is written in a Jane Austen-esque prose and is really quite humorous. On the subject of punk, there's also the subgenre of diesel punk, which isn't that well known as steampunk because, frankly, there aren't that many books in this genre. Diesel punk is usually set in the early 20th century when diesel engines ruled. Think World War I up to the 1950s. By the way, if there are no fantasy elements, this would be considered a science fiction subgenre under alternate histories like Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle. But by far my favorite diesel punk author is China Miéville. The Perdido Street Station novels are fantastic, and his writing definitely puts the punk in diesel punk. There's also a few punk subgenres that I'm really not familiar with, but I'll mention them because I ran across them and think they're interesting. The first being coal punk or deco punk, set in roughly the same period as diesel punk, but with an Art Deco aesthetic. And then there's atom punk, set in the atomic age, usually during the early period of the Cold War, so just post-World War II. Again, I'm not familiar with these subgenres, but if you are, let me know some examples in the comments below. There are also fantasy subgenres which can be either low fantasy or high fantasy. One of these subgenres that has been gaining traction is Gunpowder fantasy, where magic exists alongside guns. My favorite is The Gunpowder Mage by Brian McKellen. Highly recommend that one. There's also a subgenre called Flintlock fantasy, another one that I'm not that familiar with. I don't think I've read any books in that subgenre, but it is fantasy alongside flintlock technology, so maybe fantasy set in a Three Musketeers type setting. Another fantasy subgenre is military fantasy, which sounds very testosterone heavy, and it is, but it emphasizes the life of a soldier and has lots of focus on the military. I strongly recommend The Jackal of Nar by John Marco as a good example of military fantasy that is very well written. I've also seen Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives classified as military fantasy. One of my favorite fantasy genres is portal fantasy, which usually starts as a contemporary, but with a gateway to a high fantasy realm. Portal fantasies, of course, can be traced back to C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, but it doesn't have to be confined to middle grade or young adult. The Landover novels by Terry Brooks is a great portal fantasy for adults. I mentioned fairy tales at the start, and yes, there is a fairy tale retelling subgenre, which could either be high fantasy or low fantasy, adult, young adult, or middle grade. Kenneth Lee wrote some great dark fairy tale retellings back in the 80s in her anthology Red as Blood. Oh, and we can't forget erotic fantasy. I don't read much in this subgenre, but Jacqueline Carey's Crucial series fits here, I think, and it is an immensely well-written and enjoyable read. Now, there is one category that I'll purposefully skipped, and that is magical realism, which a lot of people put as a subgenre of fantasy. However, I don't. Going back to the overarching genre of speculative fiction, personally, I'd have magical realism as its own major genre. Magical realism, if you don't know, is set in either contemporary or historical times, but there's a thin veil between the spiritual and material worlds which impacts the stories. There's no elves or fairies or fireballs, but there is this spiritual, surreal component that impacts the storyline that makes the otherwise real characters and plot veer into the surreal. Magical realism originated in Latin America going back to 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and is often considered a Latin American style of writing, though of course you find it in non-Latin American books. One of my recent favorites is When You Trap a Tiger by Tay Keller, a recent middle grade novel which won the Newbery Award. Now, the reason I don't group magical realism with fantasy is simple. You won't normally find magical realism in the fantasy section. Publishers and booksellers know their customers and know that the majority of readers who enjoy magical realism don't usually visit the fantasy and science fiction section of bookshelves in bookstores, so they're instead shelved along with general fiction. Which makes sense because hardcore fantasy readers probably are going to be disappointed if they pick up a magical realism novel expecting something else, something more traditionally fantasy. So why put magical realism under fantasy when it isn't grouped under fantasy? Now, if all these subgenres are confusing, and remember I haven't even covered them all, don't worry about it. Remember, grouping books in genres and subgenres are to help readers, like you and I, find similar books. If you've seen those booktube videos, if you like this book, then you may like that book. That's all subgenres are meant to do, to help you find comparable books. Personally, I don't pay that much attention to subgenres because I find I like all fantasy, but that's not to say I don't occasionally search out for epic fantasy if I'm in a certain kind of mood. Now, you may be wondering why some of the books I'll mention don't perfectly fit into one subgenre, that they sound like they could fit into several other subgenres. You would be absolutely right. In fact, most fantasy books could fit into several subgenres, and that's fine. George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones could fit under high fantasy, epic fantasy, dark or grimdark fantasy, military fantasy, and so on. Again, the only reason to assign a subgenre to a book is to help other readers find similar stories. This brings us to the use of fantasy in the digital age and those who use Amazon. Yes, we're going to talk about Amazon again. When browsing books on Amazon, you'll see sales of books ranked in different subgenres, usually in several different subgenres That's because Amazon allows publishers and indie authors assign their books to multiple genres and subgenres. I think you can have up to 10 different genres flagged for your novel. So, of course, to increase sales, the publisher is going to pick every conceivable genre or subgenre to fit the book under, even if most people wouldn't consider it in that genre. Indie authors, if they're smart, will do the exact same thing because it's all about increasing exposure in sales, but this makes it confusing for the reader who may be looking for a specific type of book. Subgenre categories are meant to help readers, but if every fantasy book is categorized for every fantasy subgenre, what's the point of even having subgenres? It almost becomes meaningless. I'm curious about what you think about it, so let me know down in the comments. And let me know if you have a favorite fantasy subgenre. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.